The video that ended my 40-year marriage arrived in my inbox at 10:17 on a Tuesday morning. The subject line contained only 5 words. You deserve to know this. I almost deleted it. At 68, I had learned that anonymous emails rarely brought anything worth reading. But something made me pause. Maybe it was the strange calm I felt when I clicked it open. Maybe it was the feeling that my life was about to split into a before and an after. I was sitting at my desk in the accounting office my husband and I had built together decades ago. Outside my window, the maple trees swayed in the Connecticut breeze. Inside, the office hummed with the ordinary sounds of printers, keyboards, and ringing phones. Everything looked normal. Everything felt normal. Then I opened the attachment. The video lasted less than 2 minutes. I watched it once. Then I watched it again. My hand stayed perfectly still on the desk. My breathing never changed. When it ended, I closed the screen and stared at my reflection in the dark monitor. The woman looking back at me had silver hair, tired blue eyes, and a marriage that had just quietly fallen apart. The 2 people in that video were the last people I ever expected to see together. My husband, Daniel Brooks, and my daughter-in-law, Vanessa Brooks. Nothing inappropriate was shown. Nothing dramatic. But there was no mistaking the intimacy, the familiarity, the secret they believed nobody else could see. The way they looked at each other told me more than words ever could. I didn't cry. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't call my son Ryan. Instead, I opened the spreadsheet I had been working on before the email arrived and finished balancing the quarterly figures. That probably sounds strange, maybe even cold. But after raising a family, surviving financial hardships, caring for aging parents, and burying dreams I never spoke about, I had learned something important. Panic never reveals the truth. Patience does. At noon, I walked 3 blocks to my favorite diner and ordered a turkey sandwich and a cup of coffee. The waitress, who had known me for years, asked how my day was going. I smiled and said, "Quiet so far." It was the truth. The storm was happening entirely inside me. By the time I returned to the office, I had made a decision. I would tell no one what I had seen. Not yet. If Daniel and Vanessa had hidden this for months, maybe years, then one leaked video was only the beginning. Secrets like theirs never existed alone. They left footprints. They left transactions. They left messages. And somewhere behind that video was a story much bigger than betrayal. As the afternoon sun stretched across my desk, I opened a blank notebook and wrote the date at the top of the page. Under it, I wrote 4 simple words. Find out everything first. That night, I drove home along the same winding roads I had traveled for years, passing the white church where Daniel and I were married and the little ice cream stand where we used to take Ryan every summer. Nothing looked different. That was the strange thing about betrayal. The world kept moving exactly as it had the day before. The traffic lights changed. The stores closed. Neighbors walked their dogs. Meanwhile, an entire life could quietly collapse behind a polite smile. When I pulled into the driveway, Daniel's truck was already there. Through the kitchen window, I could see him standing at the counter pouring himself coffee. For a moment, I simply sat in my car with the engine off. 40 years. 40 years of birthdays, anniversaries, mortgage payments, family vacations, late-night conversations, and ordinary Tuesdays. I wondered how many of those years had been real and how many had only existed in my imagination. By the time I stepped inside, my expression was calm again. Daniel looked up and smiled. "Long day?" he asked. "The usual," I replied. His smile never changed. Neither did mine. We ate dinner together that evening. Grilled chicken, green beans, and baked potatoes. The same simple meal we had shared dozens of times before. He talked about a supplier issue at work. I nodded at the right moments. He asked about my day. I told him everything except the one thing that mattered. Across the table, his face looked familiar, comfortingly familiar. Yet I suddenly realized how little I actually knew about the man sitting in front of me. After dinner, Daniel settled into his recliner to watch the evening news. I carried a cup of tea upstairs and opened the notebook I had started earlier. Instead of writing about the video, I began listing memories. Not happy memories. Suspicious ones. The first thing that came to mind was Vanessa. Over the past 2 years, she had started stopping by the house more often. At the time, I thought she was simply being thoughtful. Ryan traveled frequently for work, and Vanessa often claimed she did not like being alone. Sometimes she arrived with homemade cookies. Sometimes she brought coffee. Sometimes she stayed only 15 minutes. Other times she lingered for hours. Looking back, the visits always seemed to happen when Ryan was out of town. I turned the page and kept writing. A canceled family barbecue. A business conference Daniel suddenly needed to attend. A weekend when neither Daniel nor Vanessa answered their phones for several hours. Individually, each memory seemed harmless. Together, they formed a pattern. For the first time, I stopped asking whether something was wrong. Instead, I asked a different question. How long had it been happening right in front of me? The next morning, I arrived at the office 30 minutes earlier than usual. The building was quiet, the hallways empty except for the faint hum of the ventilation system. I unlocked my office door, set down my purse, and opened the notebook again. The list from the night before stared back at me. What unsettled me most was not the video itself. It was how quickly the missing pieces were beginning to fit together. For years, I had trusted my instincts when it came to finances. Numbers told stories. They revealed patterns people thought nobody would notice. That morning, I decided to treat my own life the same way. I began reviewing old calendars, family photos, and emails. Not searching for proof. Searching for timing. Within an hour, I found something strange. 2 summers earlier, Ryan had spent 10 days in Seattle overseeing a major project. During that exact period, Vanessa had told the family she was visiting a college friend in Boston. I remembered it because she had shown me photos afterward. At the time, I never questioned them. Now I checked the dates. During those same 10 days, Daniel had claimed he was attending a regional business conference in Vermont. I leaned back slowly in my chair. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe not. By lunchtime, more details surfaced. A charity gala Daniel had skipped because of an alleged migraine. Vanessa had canceled as well, citing a family emergency. A Christmas shopping trip that unexpectedly lasted an entire day. Several Sunday afternoons when both had become unavailable at the same time. Individually, none of it meant anything. Together, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Around 3 o'clock, my office phone rang. It was Vanessa. Her cheerful voice filled the line. She wanted to know whether Daniel had mentioned a family dinner she was planning the following weekend. I listened carefully as she spoke. Her tone was relaxed, friendly, completely normal. If she felt any guilt, it never reached her voice. That sounds lovely, I replied. Let me check my schedule. We exchanged a few more polite words before ending the call. The moment I hung up, I wrote down everything she had said. Not because it was important, because I had started paying attention. Later that evening, I stopped by a grocery store on the way home. While comparing prices on coffee, I noticed a familiar face at the far end of the aisle. It took me a second to recognize her. Megan Foster. She had worked briefly with Daniel several years earlier before moving to another company. She saw me first and offered a hesitant smile. There was something unusual in her expression. Not surprise. Not happiness. Concern. Before I could say anything, she walked toward me. Eleanor, she said quietly. I have been meaning to call you for a long time. Something in her voice made my stomach tighten. Then she glanced around to make sure nobody was listening and said words I would never forget. There are things you deserve to know about Daniel. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The grocery store around us continued as if nothing unusual had happened. Shopping carts rolled past. A child laughed somewhere near the bakery section. An employee stacked cans on a shelf. Yet the look in Megan Foster's eyes told me that my life was about to change again. Would you like to get coffee? She asked gently. 20 minutes later, we were sitting in a small cafe across the street. The evening crowd was thin, and the quiet corner table gave us privacy. Megan wrapped both hands around her coffee cup before speaking. She looked nervous, as if she had rehearsed this conversation many times and still did not know where to begin. I almost called you several times over the years, she said. But I never had proof. Only suspicions. I listened without interrupting. When I worked with Daniel, people noticed things. She paused. Nothing obvious. Nothing that would have justified an accusation. But there were rumors. My chest tightened, though my face remained calm. What kind of rumors? Megan looked down for a moment before answering. That he was spending a lot of company time helping someone outside the business. A younger woman. Someone he seemed unusually invested in. I already knew who she meant. Even so, hearing it aloud felt different. Real. Heavier. Megan continued carefully. At first, everyone assumed it was mentoring. Then people started noticing unusual meetings. Personal phone calls. Scheduled changes that never quite made sense. I stared through the cafe window at the darkening sky. The memories from my notebook returned one by one. The missed events, the unexplained absences, the convenient excuses. Did you ever see them together? I asked. Megan nodded slowly. Several times. Nothing inappropriate, but enough to make me uncomfortable. She hesitated again. The truth is, Eleanor, I think people around them noticed something long before you did. Most just chose not to get involved. That sentence hurt more than I expected. Not because strangers had stayed silent. Because I wondered how blind I must have been. Megan reached into her purse and removed a folded piece of paper. I debated whether to bring this. She slid it across the table. It was a copy of an old hotel conference schedule from nearly 2 years earlier. Several names were highlighted. Daniel's name appeared on the list. So did Vanessa's. According to family stories at the time, neither of them had attended that conference. They had supposedly been in different states for entirely different reasons. My fingers rested lightly on the paper. Another piece of the puzzle. Another coincidence that no longer felt like a coincidence. Why tell me now? I finally asked. Megan's expression softened. Because I recently saw something that confirmed my fears. And because you deserve honesty. She looked directly at me. Whatever is happening did not begin recently. I believe it has been going on for years. As we left the cafe, the night air felt colder than before. I drove home slowly, replaying every word she had said. When I walked through the front door, Daniel was sitting in the living room reading a magazine. He smiled when he saw me. The same familiar smile I had trusted for decades. I smiled back. Then I went upstairs, opened my notebook, and wrote a new sentence beneath everything else. This was no longer a suspicion. It was an investigation. The following week, I stopped looking for emotional answers and started looking for financial ones. Feelings could be denied. Memories could be questioned. Numbers rarely lied. For more than 30 years, I had helped oversee parts of our family's finances. Not because Daniel asked me to, but because that was how we built our life together. We reviewed budgets at the kitchen table. We planned investments together. We discussed retirement goals and charitable donations. Trust had always been part of the process. That trust now gave me a place to start. Early one morning, before anyone else arrived at the office, I began reviewing records that I legally had access to as a business partner. I expected to find nothing unusual. Instead, I found small transactions that immediately caught my attention. They were not large enough to trigger concern on their own. A few $1,000s here, several hundred there. Consulting reimbursements, travel expenses, vendor adjustments. Perfectly ordinary labels attached to perfectly ordinary amounts. Yet many of them shared one thing in common. They led back to accounts connected to the same city where Vanessa had lived before marrying Ryan. I spent the next several days carefully tracing the pattern. The deeper I looked, the clearer it became. The transfers stretched back almost 2 years. Some were indirect. Others were routed through business expenses. None were dramatic enough to attract attention individually. Together, however, they represented a significant amount of money. One afternoon, I sat alone in my office staring at the final total written across a yellow legal pad. My heart sank. It was not just a question of loyalty anymore. It was a question of deception. I made copies of every document and stored them in a secure folder. Then I went home and prepared dinner as if nothing had changed. Daniel spent most of the evening talking about a renovation project at the office. I listened quietly while studying him from across the table. He seemed relaxed, comfortable, completely unaware that the walls around his secret were beginning to crack. A few days later, Ryan stopped by unexpectedly. He looked tired from traveling and dropped into a chair in my kitchen with a weary smile. We talked about work, the weather, and his plans for the upcoming summer. As he spoke, I watched him carefully. There was no sign that he suspected anything. No hesitation when he mentioned Vanessa. No bitterness when he mentioned his father. If there was a secret, Ryan was not part of it. That realization hurt more than I expected. Whatever had happened, my son appeared to be another victim of the same deception. After he left, I sat alone at the kitchen table long after sunset. The house was silent except for the ticking clock above the stove. For the first time since this began, I knew exactly what I was dealing with. This was bigger than a damaged marriage. Bigger than a family betrayal. Someone had been moving money, hiding relationships, and counting on trust to keep the truth buried. They were wrong. Over the next 2 weeks, I settled into a routine that felt strangely normal on the surface and completely different underneath. Every morning, I woke up beside Daniel. made coffee, read the news, and went to work. Every evening, we shared dinner and discussed ordinary things. A neighbor replacing a fence, rising gas prices, Ryan's latest business trip. We played our roles so well that sometimes I almost forgot what I knew. Almost. The notebook continued to grow. So did the folder of financial records. By now, I had documented enough irregularities to convince myself that the transfers were not accidental. The amounts varied, but the direction never changed. Resources flowed away from places where they belonged and toward places connected to Vanessa. The pattern was deliberate. What I still did not understand was why Daniel had taken such risks. One Thursday afternoon, I received a call from Ryan. He sounded unusually cheerful. "Mom, Vanessa is planning a big family gathering next month," he said. "She wants everyone there." I closed my office door and sat down. "That sounds wonderful," I replied. "What is the occasion?" "Dad's upcoming retirement celebration," Ryan said. "She has been organizing it for weeks." After the call ended, I sat quietly for several minutes. A retirement celebration. The timing felt almost ironic. The man who had spent years constructing a hidden life was preparing to stand in front of family, friends, and business associates to celebrate honesty, hard work, and legacy. Later that evening, Daniel mentioned the event himself. He seemed pleased by the attention. Proud, even. As he spoke, I noticed something I had overlooked before. Whenever Vanessa's name came up in conversation, his expression changed slightly. It was subtle, a small shift around the eyes, a quick smile that disappeared almost immediately, the kind of thing most people would never notice. But once you see a pattern, you begin seeing it everywhere. That weekend, I visited Megan again. We met at a small park near the river and walked slowly along a paved trail lined with maple trees. She listened carefully as I explained what I had discovered. When I finished, she stopped walking and looked directly at me. "What are you going to do?" she asked. It was a simple question, yet I realized I had been avoiding it for days. Because the truth was complicated. Part of me wanted answers. Part of me wanted accountability. And part of me wanted to protect Ryan from a truth that could shatter his world. "I am not ready to confront anyone," I finally said. Megan nodded. "Then wait until you are." On my drive home, her words stayed with me. Wait until you are. For the first time, I understood that patience was no longer about gathering evidence. I already had evidence. Patience was about timing, about making sure the truth appeared in a place where it could not be denied, explained away, or quietly buried. That night, I opened my notebook and wrote a single sentence across an empty page. They think they control the story. They do not know I have already reached the final chapter. The retirement celebration arrived on a warm Saturday evening in early June. Vanessa had chosen an elegant event space overlooking the river, a place filled with floor-to-ceiling windows and soft golden lighting. Nearly everyone important in Daniel's life was there. Former colleagues, business partners, neighbors, relatives, and longtime family friends moved through the room, carrying glasses of sparkling cider and exchanging stories about the years they had known him. From the outside, it looked like the perfect tribute to a successful man. I arrived 10 minutes early and took my time walking through the crowd. People greeted me warmly. Several told me how lucky Daniel had been to have such a supportive wife for so many years. I smiled politely and thanked them. The irony was almost painful. Across the room, Daniel stood beside Ryan and Vanessa. They looked relaxed, comfortable, confident. Watching them together, I realized something important. None of them knew what I knew. Ryan still believed he was celebrating his father's accomplishments. Daniel believed his secrets remained hidden. Vanessa believed she had successfully managed every detail of the evening. For the first time in weeks, I felt completely calm. Not because the situation hurt less, because uncertainty had disappeared. I knew the truth. The evening unfolded exactly as planned. Dinner was served. Speeches were given. A slideshow played on large screens, showing photographs from Daniel's career and our family's history. There we were as newlyweds. There was Ryan as a little boy holding a fishing pole beside his father. There were holiday gatherings, vacations, birthdays, and anniversaries. 40 years compressed into a collection of smiling images. People applauded at the end. Daniel appeared genuinely moved. Then Vanessa stepped onto the small stage and thanked everyone for attending. She spoke about loyalty, family, commitment, and legacy. Each word landed differently now. Every sentence sounded rehearsed, carefully constructed. When she finished, the room applauded once more. Then she smiled toward me. "And now," she said, "I would love for Eleanor to share a few words." For a brief moment, dozens of faces turned in my direction. Ryan smiled encouragingly. Daniel looked pleased. Vanessa appeared confident. Exactly as I had hoped. I walked slowly to the front of the room and accepted the microphone. The crowd became quiet. Through the large windows behind them, the river reflected the colors of the setting sun. I began with simple memories. The early years of marriage. Building a business together. Raising Ryan. The audience listened attentively. Several people nodded as I spoke. Then I paused, long enough for the silence to become noticeable. "Over the past few weeks," I said calmly, "I have spent a great deal of time reflecting on honesty." The atmosphere changed almost instantly. Not dramatically, just enough. I saw Daniel straighten slightly in his chair. Vanessa's smile faded for a fraction of a second. Ryan looked confused. I continued speaking in the same steady voice. "I have also learned that the truth has a way of waiting patiently. Sometimes for years. But eventually, it always arrives." And in that moment, I knew the next few minutes would change every life in that room. The room remained silent as I stood at the microphone. No one interrupted. No one knew what was coming next. I set a small folder on the podium and looked around the crowd one last time. Friends, relatives, business partners, people who had trusted Daniel for years. "I did not come here tonight to embarrass anyone," I said calmly. "I came here because honesty matters." I reached for the remote connected to the presentation screen behind me. Several guests assumed I was about to show another family photograph. Instead, a document appeared on the screen. It was a financial summary. Names and account numbers had been removed, but the dates and transaction history were clear. A quiet murmur spread through the audience. Daniel's expression changed immediately. Vanessa sat perfectly still. "Over the past several weeks," I continued, "I discovered a pattern of financial transfers that should never have happened." I clicked to the next slide. More records appeared. Then another. Then another. Every document supported the one before it. There were no accusations. Only facts. The audience began studying the screen with growing confusion. Ryan looked from the documents to his father and back again. "Mom," he said quietly from his table. "What is this?" I met his eyes. "The truth," I answered. The words seemed to hang in the air. Daniel stood halfway from his chair. "Eleanor," he said, attempting a smile. "Perhaps this is not the right place." I turned toward him. "I agree. The right place would have been years ago." The smile disappeared. Another slide appeared. This time it showed travel records and conference schedules. Dates that matched. Locations that matched. Excuses that no longer matched. The room became so quiet that I could hear the air conditioning system running above us. Vanessa lowered her gaze toward the table. Ryan looked increasingly confused. Several guests exchanged nervous glances. I never raised my voice. I never rushed. I simply continued presenting the information exactly as I had found it. Piece by piece. Date by date. Fact by fact. Finally, I reached the last item in the folder. I paused before opening it. The audience waited. Daniel's face had lost all color. The message was simple, clear, impossible to misunderstand. When I finished speaking, I closed the folder and stepped away from the podium. Nobody applauded. Nobody spoke. The silence was heavier than any argument could have been. Then Ryan slowly stood from his chair. He looked first at Vanessa, then at Daniel. Neither one said a word. And in that moment, everyone in the room understood exactly why. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected. There were no dramatic confrontations, no public arguments, no desperate attempts to rewrite what had happened. The truth had already done its work. Once people see something clearly, it becomes very difficult to pretend they never saw it at all. Ryan called me 3 days after the retirement celebration. His voice sounded older somehow. Not physically older, but heavier. Like someone who had spent several sleepless nights asking questions he never imagined he would need to ask. We met at a small diner halfway between our homes. The same diner where I had often stopped for coffee after work. When I arrived, Ryan was already there, staring out the window at the parking lot. He stood and hugged me the moment he saw me. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, he pulled back and sat down. "I am sorry," he said quietly. I shook my head. "You have nothing to apologize for." He looked down at his hands. "I should have noticed something." "No," I replied. "The people who create deception depend on trust. That is why it works." We talked for nearly 2 hours. Not about blame. not about anger. We talked about healing, about moving forward, about accepting difficult truths without allowing them to define the rest of our lives. By the time we left, I could see a small amount of peace returning to him. It would take time, but he would be all right. As for Daniel, the consequences arrived gradually. Business relationships changed. Invitations became less frequent. People who had once trusted him became more cautious. He was not destroyed. Life rarely works that way. But the image he had spent decades building no longer existed in quite the same form. Trust, once broken, is difficult to rebuild. Vanessa eventually moved away from the area. I heard occasional updates through mutual acquaintances, but I no longer paid much attention. There was a time when I believed understanding every detail would help me heal. I eventually learned the opposite was true. Healing began the moment I stopped centering my life around other people's choices. 6 months later, I sold the large family home. Walking through the empty rooms for the final time was emotional, but not in the way I expected. I was not mourning the past. I was thanking it. Every room held memories. Some painful, many beautiful. None of them belonged to the betrayal. They belonged to me. A few weeks after the sale, I moved to a small coastal town in Maine. My new home sat less than a mile from the ocean. Every morning, I walked along the shoreline with a cup of coffee and watched the sun rise over the water. The air smelled different there. Cleaner, lighter. For the first time in years, I felt the same way. One evening, as I sat on my porch listening to the waves in the distance, I opened the notebook that had started everything. The pages were filled with dates, observations, records, and questions. At the very end, I wrote one final sentence before closing it forever. The truth did not destroy my life. It revealed the people who were trying to. Then I placed the notebook on a shelf, looked out toward the ocean, and quietly began the next chapter.